Y bueno, yo sobre todo quería transmitiros que es una suerte que podamos tener a Alison Killing con nosotros, porque creo que es una de las personas, desde el trabajo que está desarrollando los últimos años, es una de las personas que, bueno, desde nuestra perspectiva, puede ofrecer una mejor visión de la lectura que se puede hacer de muchos procesos de activación de espacios en diferentes países, ¿no? Y bueno, en especial yo os recomiendo que le echéis un vistazo, aunque ella seguramente hablará de ello, alguno de los trabajos que ha hecho, empezando por un pequeño libro que para mí pues fue muy sugerente, que se llamaba Urban Tactics and Long-Term Planning, porque ahí presentaba ya unas experiencias y una lectura sobre cuáles eran algunas de las conclusiones que se podían sacar sobre proyectos, en algunos casos, que ya eran conocidos, ¿no? Y en los últimos años, sobre todo en el último año, sí que ha estado desarrollando una cuestión muy específica que tiene que ver con las estrategias y hasta con los modelos de negocio que están detrás de los proyectos. Y esto, que hablar de modelos de negocio cuando estamos hablando de proyectos muy desde el activismo puede parecer un poco chocante, pero sin embargo, más allá del nombre, lo que hace es preguntarse por la gran cuestión que en muchos casos está detrás de estos proyectos de activación, ¿no? Realmente esto cómo se sostiene, realmente puede tener, está basado únicamente en el trabajo voluntario, en el voluntarismo, en el activismo y en la pasión que podemos poner sobre esos proyectos, o realmente si es verdad lo que decimos, que tienen un componente de servicio público, de activación de capacidades de la ciudad, cuál es el modelo de relación con las instituciones públicas que en teoría deben velar por el cumplimiento de esa función de esos espacios, ¿no? Yo creo que son perspectivas interesantes o novedosas que son las que queremos traer al curso. Y bueno, pues en cuanto esté el ordenador empezará ya.
So, in winter 1979, on the Lower East Side of New York, a group of artists broke into an abandoned building to stage an art exhibition, which they wanted to use to protest the city's real estate policies. It wasn't the intention in the beginning, but a cultural centre grew up in that building off the back of that initial action. And that cultural centre was called ABC No Rio. They started hosting poetry readings and punk and music nights. They started to hold exhibitions, and they set up a zine library, and they built workshops for photography and silkscreen printing. And a community grew up around the centre. Now, the owner of the building was the city, and after a while, an agreement was made that ABC No Rio could rent the building at a very low cost, on the condition that they would leave quickly if and when the city wanted their building back. And throughout this period that lasted through the 80s and into the 90s, relations with the city were quite strained. Finally, the rental agreement broke down over a dispute about maintenance. This was sometime in the mid-90s, and the city decided that they wanted to evict when ABC No Rio said that they weren't prepared to pay their rent anymore. So ABC No Rio decided to take things into their own hands. They wanted to keep the cultural centre open, and to secure the building, a group moved into the upper floors to squat the building and secure it. And they also rallied their community for support. So they fought to stay, and they managed to win. The city relented. But the situation carried on for a while, with every few months or every couple of years, the city would try to evict them again, and ABC Rio would rally their community, fight to stay, and win. And then things finally came to a head in 1999 after a final eviction attempt and after major protests on the part of the cultural centre. The city relented, and they offered to sell ABC No Rio the building for the sum of $1. And there were just two conditions. The squatters had to leave the building, and they also had to raise the $5 million necessary to refurbish the building completely. Now, that last bit was a struggle. It's very, very difficult to raise money to refurbish a building that you don't own. But actually, they managed to do it. Their network helped. One day, they even opened an envelope, and there was a check inside it for $1 million, and it was anonymous, and they still have no idea who gave it to them. And ABC No Rio is now busy constructing their new building on the site of the original one. Now, in many ways, this is an exceptional story, but also in many ways, ABC No Rio is different from many of the temporary use projects that we see today in our cities. But there's a key way that it's not different, and that's in the magic of the story. It's, the group of artists and the community that they established, that anonymous $1 million donation, the obstacles that they overcame, and the exceptional talent and perseverance and luck of the people who set up and ran the project. And I think that this magic is something that we expect of temporary use projects. And I also think that it's not good enough. I'm an architect and urban designer, and I'm English, but I'm based in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. A couple of years ago, I got funding from the Dutch Funds for Creative Industry to look a little bit more critically at some of these temporary use projects and what the factors were for them being successful. I set quite a low bar for success. By successful, I mean that the project actually happened. I didn't only look at short-term projects, I also looked at some that had begun 20 or 30 years ago and had maybe come to be the permanent tenants in their building, because I wanted to get a historical perspective on this sort of movement. And I also looked at these projects internationally, so in the UK and in the US, in the Netherlands, in Germany, and also in Israel, because I wanted to get a sense of whether there were patterns in how these projects worked. So I looked at a range of projects. I looked at art interventions and temporary shops and bars and community gardens, artist studios, housing cooperatives, shared workspaces. Some of these buildings were very short term. They lasted for maybe a few days, a weekend. Others had rolling contracts where the landlord could ask for the building back at like 2 weeks' notice. Some of them had fixed-term contracts for 2 or 3 years, and others had begun as squats and had gradually become regularized. So some of them finally became permanent tenants or even owners in their buildings. But what I found in all cases was that there were 3 main criteria for success. Firstly, they need high-level political support. Because these projects don't conform to the standard ways of doing things, they actually need quite a lot of help to get going. For example, the standard process of getting a building permit is incredibly onerous if you have an installation that's only going to last for 1 month. It's out of all proportion to what you're trying to do. So that means that you tend to need high-level political support to help find a way through the system and to help find a level of regulation which is appropriate to what you want to do. The second thing that these projects often need is an intermediary organization to help them. That might be an arts organization or a biennale, or it might be a sort of matchmaking organization that finds landlords with empty buildings and matches them with people who want to do a project. And the reason that people need this is that they need the help of someone who has an established network and already has the trust of everyone involved, so that people are then prepared to take the risk and allow the project to go ahead. The last thing that these projects need, though, is funding, and they often struggle to find it. And this was the most common cause of failure that I found amongst these projects. Now, funding is a really difficult issue. The non-commercial projects that I looked at, the cultural and community projects, they have a lot of things in common with arts projects that you'll know about. People tend to think that artists don't need to be paid and that they do what they do out of love. And, maybe those artists are actually quite bad at finding ways to get paid. But there's something bigger than that, and it affects both the commercial and the non-commercial projects. And it's actually investment, and the way that we think about models for investment in temporary use projects. Now, something that isn't always recognized, and I think should be explicitly, is that property owners are making a huge investment in these projects by allowing people to use their building or to use their land. Now, there can be very real advantages for them in doing this, but still that investment needs to be recognized. The other thing that needs to be recognized and is typically overlooked, though, is the fact that you need to make an investment in that building or land in order to be able to use it for your project. And a lot of people don't realize that actually the amount that you need to put in to make a temporary use project happen is often very, very similar to what you would need to do something permanent in the same place. the investment that you need is just out of proportion typically to the project itself. That means that you then need to have the building long enough to be able to make a return on the money and the time that you've invested in it and into making the space usable, even if that mainly means that you just have time for your investment to depreciate. But you need to have the building long enough that the money and the time that you put into it was worth the effort. So I again got funding from the Creative Industries Fund, and this time it was specifically to look at funding models for these projects. The idea was to look at how these projects could be supported at 2 key points. So at startup, when they need a lot of money to invest and to get going, and then also in the longer term, because actually many of these projects last for several years. And, this research is of obvious interest to the people who are doing these projects and are trying to fund them and to make them work. But I also wanted to reach out beyond those people. I wanted to reach the people, the municipalities and the project developers and the urban designers who either have these spaces and want to fill them temporarily or want to fit temporary use projects into their strategies. And I wanted to help them to commission these projects better. Now, I did 2 things when I was looking at this. The first thing was to go out and talk to some of these key stakeholders. So I talked to people in charge of regeneration at the local municipality, or property developers, or the housing associations who had allowed their spaces to be used for temporary use. And I asked those people what they thought the advantages and disadvantages of these projects were, and how they could be done better. And I ended up with quite a list. The second thing that I did, though, was to go and talk to the people who are actually doing these projects and get them to tell me their story. But I also got them to give me their accounts. Now, at first, that might sound really boring, but I promise you it's not. So many of these temporary use projects have a very, very similar story superficially. And it kind of goes something like this. I'm sure you've all heard something similar before. There's this amazing group of people, and they have a great idea. They have this period of struggle where they're trying to find a space, and, the landlord's a bit of an arsehole, they can't do it, they're struggling to find funding. They have all of these obstacles, but finally they overcome them, and the project's a big success. And you have all of these photographs of the sun shining and children smiling. Like, we've all heard that story before, right? But I wanted to look a little bit more closely and a little bit more critically at that story, because I wanted to find out what was going on behind the scenes and why. And the accounts allow you to do that. In the accounts, you get to see the story of every challenge and every failure and every success of these projects. So if we can understand how these projects are working, we can find better ways to support them. So I took the accounts and I turned them into visual infographics that showed things like how much time people need to spend on their project at different key stages, and how much money they need to spend at key points, and how that fits with when they're getting money in, and how much and from where. By showing this graphically, I could help people to quickly understand what was going on with these projects. By pairing the graphics of the accounts with the story of what's happening, you can tell the real story of how a particular project unfolded, and you can get a complete view of what's happening. It also allows you to see where the risks are in these projects and gives you some idea of how those could be mitigated. And it also helps you to perhaps spot a few opportunities as well. Now, I'd like to show you a couple more projects now, and I'd like to show you what I found out from their accounts. But the first thing that I'd actually like to do is to show you what I think an ideal situation looks like. And I'd like to show you that in terms of 2 things. It's like the amount of work that needs to be done at each stage, and also the money that's going in and out. So before you begin any project, there's a period of research. There's no real money at this point, and you don't need to spend a lot, but you need to spend a lot of time, and you're developing your idea and finding a space, making an agreement with and getting a contract to be able to use it, finding funding if you need it, and also reaching out to the local community to find out what they want and to get their support. And then you have a startup phase, and here you have a lot of work and you need quite a lot of money. That big spike is all of the investment that a project needs as it's starting. And that could be a lot of things. It could be that you need to paint the building. It might be that you need to put in a new electrical system or fix the internet. But it's also softer things like building a website for the project or getting posters and flyers printed, getting stock for your shop or for your bar. And you might also need to start paying people at this point. So your expenditure increases because of that. And the time that you spend also spikes because it also takes a lot of work to get all of that done. The last bit's where you're running the project and things get a lot more stable. Your overheads are the same every month. You know how much rent you're paying. You're paying kind of the same for like your heating and your lighting. And the amount of work that you're doing is predictable. So with that ideal situation in mind, I'd like to tell you about another project that I looked at, which was called the Canning Town Caravanserai, and it's in East London. Now, in 2011, the London Borough of Newham, which is the borough of London that the Caravanserai is now in, they held a competition called Meanwhile London. They had 4 large sites that were part of the former Docklands in London, and they were all vacant, awaiting development. The council were looking for groups who could take these sites on temporarily and who would be able to do something interesting. So competition entrants were asked to put together a short proposal for one of the sites, and then the winning proposal on each site would get that land for a period of between 2 and 5 years. And the Canning Town Caravanserai won one of the sites. Now, the team behind it was quite a large group. They were artists and architects and designers and landscape architects. And their proposal was to have this big mix of small-scale activities on the site. They wanted to have, a community garden and a playground, but also a lot of these small workspaces for local people. And those workspaces would double as shops where they could sell the goods. And the idea was that those shops would pay a small amount of rent, and that would help to fund the whole project. But that wasn't their main funding strategy. There was an old housing block on the site, and they planned to turn that into a hotel. And in that way, they would be able to pay for the entire project. But actually, it was around this funding strategy that everything started to go wrong. So just before the site was handed over to the Caravanserai team, the block of flats was demolished. And also, the gas and the electricity and the water on the site was all disconnected. At the same time, the team was given a bill of £2,000 to apply for planning permission for all of the small structures that they'd planned to build on the site. And at this point, the project completely stalled and the team disbanded because they just couldn't do the project under these conditions. A firm of architects who'd been involved from the beginning, though, who were called Ash Sakula, they decided that they wanted to take it on. And they redesigned the site and rethought the business model, and they paid the fee for the planning application. And slowly the project started to come to life. Now, the Caravanserai site is quite large. It's about 2 hectares, about 2 football fields. And it wasn't possible to develop everything at once because the funding simply wasn't there. The site was developed through a series of mini projects instead, and they were added one by one. And slowly, this growing number of facilities on the site allowed more and more things to happen. So the first thing that they built was this tiny theatre project, which was built by students from the University of East London. And over the course of the next couple of years, the Caravanserai added a community garden, and they added a stage for concerts and toilets and a cafe and a series of the workspaces they'd originally planned, a giant outdoor table for feasts and community gatherings, and also a community centre that was built out of recycled materials. And this is what it looks like today. The team's done a really amazing job, and the site is full of people and activities and all of these fantastic, colourful structures. But now I'd like to show you their accounts. Now, just to remind you of what it looks like, this is the ideal situation again, with that sort of period for the initial research, the big spike as they need to start up and spend a lot of time and money, and then it levelling out as they get into running the project. And this is the same set of graphs for the Caravanserai. Now, so what's going on with this? I mean, just to be clear about what's being shown here, these graphs cover the period from when Ash Sakula took over the project after the competition had been won and the team had already disbanded. And it goes up until around the middle of 2013. So they had a long period of initial research and development when they did the redesign and they applied for planning permission and tried to make links with the local community and apply for funding. And then after that quite long, stable development phase, you have the part where they actually start to work on site and really run the project. So what I'd like you to just look at here is the grey line in the top graph and then the time graph at the bottom. That series of spikes that you see is the times when they're building the theatre and the cafe and the toilets and the community centre. And each one of those spikes is a different construction project. When you're spending a lot of money to buy materials, for example, and you're also working a lot to get that thing built. And if you look at the blue line on the top graph, that's actually the amount of money that they had in the bank at any one time. And where you see it sort of dipping up or ticking upwards, that's when they got a small grant in to be able to pay for some of these things that they wanted to do. So Ash Sakula actually gave a lot throughout this process to keep the project going. Kani Ash, who's one of the partners of the firm, in particular, she gave a lot of time to the project, and they also took on part-time staff to help manage it. And they did that because, you know, even though it was tough and even though they had to put a lot into it, they believed in the caravanserai as an experiment in public space, and they saw it as a research project for their office. But it's clear from this graph that it wasn't a smooth, easy process. I kind of feel like they had a sort of catch-22 situation where the caravanserai needed a certain number of buildings built on the site before they could have activities to start and before they could generate their own revenue. But they couldn't get the funding to get them built, and so they could never really fully get started. And that meant that as they would get a grant, they would have a short burst of activity on site and they'd get something built, and then that activity would slow down as the team became involved in trying to organise the next thing, to organise, find that next bit of funding and work out how on earth they were going to do the next bit, finding the people who would need to be involved in building and running it. And then they would get a little bit more funding and the construction would start again, and then again it would slow down, and they carried on like this for about 1.5 years. Now, all this while, there were activities happening on site, and that's a credit to the amazing talent and perseverance of the caravanserai team. But looking at this graph, you can't help but see sort of how difficult it was and how hard that they had to work, and perhaps they shouldn't have had to work quite as hard as they did. You know, perhaps they could have been better supported from the outset. It also feels like the project was getting just enough money to survive and to keep going, but never enough to really fully thrive and to reach its potential. And I think that to a large extent, that's because the right things weren't in place to support it. There wasn't enough clarity about the agreement on the site at the beginning, and that made it very difficult to plan the project well and to find the funding that they needed. So the caravanserai team were eventually successful, but it's hard not to feel that their experience was made much more difficult than it needed to be. It's relied on exceptional talent and commitment to making that happen. And I'd like to ask you, how feasible are temporary use projects if that's what we typically ask of them? Like, how sustainable are they? And perhaps more importantly, who are we excluding from the process if we ask them to work in this way? Now, I'd like to take you back to those graphs of what an ideal situation might look like, and I'd like to look at how we might help a few more projects move towards it. This is some of the best practice that I've found. So the research phase pre-startup is really important for planning the project and for getting everything in place. And there's 2 ways that I've typically seen people do this. Either it's done by the project initiators, the people who are actually doing the project themselves, and in some cases it's done by an intermediary organisation, so someone who's trying to find temporary tenants for a number of sites or buildings. One of the best examples that I've seen of this research and startup phase is at a project called the Leeszaal in Rotterdam, which means reading room in Dutch. It's actually a community library. And it was set up by two social activists and social science researchers called Maurice Specht and Joke van der Zwaard. And they have a huge amount of experience in working in this sort of project, and they also have an incredibly strong local network. So what they did the summer before they wanted to set up the leeszaal was to go to a load of local community groups and have meetings with them and ask them, is this community library something that you would want? And people, by and large, said yes, it was. And then they said, okay, well, if this is something you want, what are you prepared to do to help to make it happen? Now, that seemed really smart to me because they knew that they would need a huge amount of help and support from the local community to get this thing done and to get it up and running. And they were able to get that buy-in right from the beginning. And startup. There are two key things here. The first is that you need to find the initial funding to get the project going. And the other thing is that you need to make a good agreement around the building or the site that you want to use. Now, I've seen people manage the funding in a few ways. One key way, particularly with commercial projects, is people invest their own capital. They invest their own money in this. But I've also seen people do that with non-commercial projects as well, if they're small. So the leeszaal again, they actually got a grant. They got a grant of €80,000 from a foundation called Stichting Doen. And that allowed them to pay their rent and all of their bills for the first year, as well as paying Maurice and Joke a small salary so that they could really afford to work on the project and give it the hours that they needed. They calculated that they worked around 20 hours a week on this project from right through the first year of working on it. For the Schwieblock, which is a shared working space in Rotterdam, the developer actually asked all of the tenants to pay their rent up front. And in that way, they were able to afford to refurbish the building, to paint it, to put in new electricity and internet and things like that. The Popdown Square project in Wembley in London, for them, a competition was held to find a tenant for the space, and the client, who was also the local council, gave a grant of £25,000 to help that project get started. After that, the project was expected to be able to sustain itself. And in several projects, people were able to get loans to help them get started. And now this was always with commercial projects who had a good means of income so they could pay it back. But the interesting thing is that with these temporary use projects, the loans almost always came from the municipality. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The first one is that with the economic crisis, even people who normally could get loans, like project developers, they were really struggling to do so. But the municipality wanted these things to happen, and so they helped them. And the other time that the municipality would step in was when there was a group of people who needed a loan in order to do a project, but they didn't have enough assets themselves to secure a loan so that if they couldn't pay it, that the bank could take something. And then the municipality stepped in as well. Now, the second thing at this stage is the contract for the use of the building or the site. And the important thing about these agreements is having clarity about what's being offered, on what terms, and for how long. And crucially, that isn't changed part of the way through, which it is changed surprisingly often, actually. That stability is necessary to plan effectively, because by knowing how long you can have the space for and on what terms, that's essential for being able to plan your project, to be able to invest at a sensible level in the building and in the project, and to know that that investment is going to have time to depreciate, that it's going to be worth the time or the money that you put into doing the project. Now, I'm sorry, that does sound really obvious that you need clear, stable agreements, but again, it's not. A lot of the buildings and sites that we see being used for these temporary use projects are vacant because the economy is uncertain. The owners of those properties, they want to let them out at commercial rates, or they want to develop the projects, but they don't know if or when they're going to be able to do it. And so for them to have a rolling contract where a temporary tenant can be asked to leave at a couple of weeks' notice is really attractive. The problem with that level of uncertainty, though, is that it rules a lot of projects out from taking place. mainly the sort of projects where you would have to invest in making the building or the site usable. I have found a couple of ways around this, though. Urban Resort is a developer in Amsterdam that sets up affordable workspaces for the creative industries. And when they moved into the Volkskrant building in Amsterdam, they had to invest around €500,000 to make the building usable. It had been really badly maintained for a long time. They had to put in new gas and water and electricity, and a lot of the tenants also wanted quite specialist things put in. Like they wanted soundproof music studios because they were musicians and wanted to practice or record. And so all of that had to be constructed. Now, if you're going to refurbish a building to a basic standard, then a good rule of thumb is that you need that building for around 5 years in order to make the money and the effort worth it. So the client of the Volkskrant wasn't fully happy with that, though. They thought that they might want it back sooner. And so the deal that they made was that Urban Resort, in principle, could have the building for 5 years. But if they wanted it back sooner, if the property owner wanted it back sooner, then they would have to pay Urban Resort a proportion of the money that they wanted to invest. And that helped to solve the problem of the uncertainty for everyone. Urban Resort could put money in. The owner could also have their building back if they really needed it. But that does leave the question of when this sort of open rolling contract is useful and when it's appropriate. You know, the kind when the owner can ask for the building back at a short period of notice, which is often the model that's used for temporary use projects. Now, it does work really well for a lot of people, but I think there's a couple of conditions which need to be met in order for it to be a good proposition. The first is that there needs to be a relatively low amount of investment needed in order to make use of the space. It works well also if you only need the space for a short time anyway, or if you're able to move easily when the owner needs the building back, which is either because you didn't have a lot of stuff anyway, or because there's other affordable alternative places nearby that you can easily move to. So let's just talk about the longer term now. Now, this is where things get a little bit trickier, and it's where the commercial and the non-commercial projects really diverge. The commercial projects, like shared workspaces, for example, are relatively straightforward because they have a clear source of income, even if it's a relatively small one at the start. But then they just have the standard issues of being in business, like they need to find work and they need to find clients and things like that. But it's worth talking about the non-commercial projects, the social and cultural ones, because we see them as offering so much to our cities, and yet they're actually quite challenging to fund at this stage. But I'd like to show you some of the strategies that I've found for these projects to fund themselves. A few things that I've found are often put forward as potential solutions, and then also some of the trade-offs in each of those. And most of these projects will need to use a mixture of different strategies. So the first strategy is really straightforward, and it's to sell tickets to your events. This is something that it ought to cover the cost of the event itself, plus a little bit more. This is what ABC No Rio did when they put on their music nights and they sold tickets for them. And if you don't have a full program of events, though, then you probably can't support your entire project and organization in this way. But it's quite a good way to get started. You can also get grants. They tend to be focused on supporting particular activities, though, like doing a play or holding an art exhibition. And it's very difficult to get them to support your overheads, to pay your rent and to pay your bills every month. So that's something that needs to be borne in mind. Another similar thing, this is something that the Leeszaal does, is that they rent out part of their space for other people to do events and activities. Again, there's a limit to how often you can do this and not have it interfere with the main use of the space, which is as a community library where people can go and sit and read quietly and study. And then there's another thing that the Leeszaal does, and that's to have a cafe or a bar. And this is something that a lot of temporary use projects, but also a lot of arts and cultural projects will do in order to raise money. There's one thing, though, that you need to know about the Leeszaal, and it's that it's run completely by volunteers. And one of the things that the volunteers like the most about working at the Leeszaal is being the host for the day and being the person who serves the tea and coffee and gets to talk to everyone that day, and really kind of gets to be the center of attention a bit as well. The Leeszaal did consider at one point giving the cafe out to, I don't know, Starbucks, someone like that, who could rent the space and then pay the Leeszaal. But if they did that, then they would lose a key reason for the volunteers to come to the space, and they would stand to alienate them, and they would lose all of the people who help them to keep going day to day. Crowdfunding is also something that's often put forward as a solution, and it's often put forward by people who've never tried it, I would have to say. And an important part of crowdfunding is that it can actually multiply the challenges of fundraising. So if you're raising funds and you have a donor, every time you have someone who gives you funding, you have a relationship with that person. You have to tell them how the project's going and how you're spending that money. And that can be a lot of work. So imagine how much bigger that is when instead of one funder, you have 500 that you need to talk to. It's a lot of work. It can be really onerous. And the other thing is that that's if you can find those 500 people, because it's actually very difficult to move beyond your own initial group of family and friends to find extra people who are going to support you. Cross-subsidy of more and less profitable activities can be a useful strategy, and this is something that Urban Resort does in Amsterdam. So they charge different rents to different groups of tenants, and they actually look at their income and sort of check how much they earn and determine their rent based on that. And then the tenants are able to cross-subsidize each other. But you need a fairly large, quite complex project for that to work. And this is the last one. It's perhaps the most overlooked, and it's the subsidy that the building owner is often providing when they give their building at a lower rent. And even though there's other benefits to the owner of having a temporary use project in the space, I'd like to ask you really, why should one building owner be asked to subsidize arts and community facilities in the city? Because funding those things has traditionally been part of what the government does. Now, one of the things that I did quite early in this research was to try and sketch out who puts what into temporary use projects and who gets what out. And I wanted to try and understand what that balance was. And I looked at that across the range of stakeholders, so the government body and the tenant and the property owner, the intermediary and other commercial properties, as well as sort of local residents and local businesses who were less directly involved. And I tried to map that in terms of, you know, how much money are they putting in, how much of their assets are they giving, and how much of their time. But also mapping the sort of softer, more intangible things that they were getting out of it. And, you know, for building owners, that might be something like the fact that a temporary use in their space can help to prove that their space is viable, and it can help to find a commercial tenant. Or for local people, it might be that, you know, their street is more lively and it's more attractive. They don't have that ugly, old, empty building anymore. They also have maybe more shops and services in their local area. But for the people who aren't directly involved in the project, they actually get a huge amount of benefit from them. And at the same time, there's not clear ways in which they're able to give back and to sort of support and invest in those projects. Except that traditionally, the way that we've funded those things that everybody benefits from in the community without paying into directly is by paying taxes to the local government, who then fund those things. So, you know, these projects might struggle, but there are important political solutions to this problem, and the municipality have a key role to play in helping to solve them. Now, I'd like to end by showing you ABC No Rio's current accounts. Now, they're definitely in the stage where they're just running the project, which is as you would hope it would be after 30 years. They have 3 main funding streams. They sell tickets to their events, they have some public funding, and they get some of their funding from private foundations as well. They have a regular program of events, which is why they're the time that they put in is completely stable, and they have a stable group of volunteers who come and help run them. And you can see that stability in these graphs. ABC No Rio's accounts are actually really, really boring. And that's actually exactly how you would want your funding situation to be, because that's the thing that provides a stable basis for being able to do much more interesting and much more valuable things. Thank you.
Have you seen some change since the beginning and what's happening today? If they learned from something, and if even the squatters, if there's been a change of their way they behave, or if they rely on those agreements?
I mean, one thing that has really changed, which is quite significant in the Netherlands, is that squatting was made illegal in 2011. Previously, it was actually legal. And many of the sort of older temporary temporary use is kind of a strange word, but it's useful to be able to talk about squats in that way. A lot of the older squats, a lot of the older projects had actually started as squats, or they were started by people who had built up their experience in squatting. A lot of those people are kind of older now, and they have more experience as well as the legal situation having changed. And it's a lot of those same people who are working in this field now. So that's where urban resort has come from. It's where the NDSM wolf has also come from. They've come from that same world. There's definitely, I think, a move to sort of to professionalize, and also to sort of to start to make better financial models so that people involved in this stuff are actually getting paid. There's less of a commitment now to the sort of a lot of the squatting ideals of we're going to work for free because we can live for free. People are much more now trying to, for example, get a license on an empty building and then rent it out in small pieces and sort of make their income that way. So things have become much more financialized, I think. Yeah.
Well, I think your presentation is, and your work and your research is quite focused on the in the internal living of the projects, how they survive, how can they thrive, how can they find the way out to find a more stable way to survive. My question is more about how, or if in your research you've been looking to the approach public authorities use to understand these projects, because I think it's part of this. It's the same coin. So we've got people trying to activate certain spaces, certain buildings, but in the end, it's or part of the equation is how public authorities have to relearn again the way they approach this kind of projects. Has this been part of your research, or what's your thoughts?
Yeah,
about
sure.
that?
I mean, definitely in the first part of the research, I went and spoke to a lot of different municipalities and asked them, what they thought about these projects. I found that although it's not something that's that well understood yet, and it's not that widespread either, but you are starting to see some examples of really good practice. Often the municipality has a very clear sort of facilitating role. They're the people who have to give permissions for these projects to go ahead, after all. So you tend to need one person who's quite high up, who supports the project and can help to make it happen. Also in terms of things like being the guarantor when a project needs to get a loan, they also need help from the municipality to do things like that. So the municipality has a key role to play in terms of funding. What I have seen, though, is that this knowledge about how to do these projects, it isn't very widespread. So you might have one person in one municipality who's able to do this, but they don't have, it's not a whole group of people within that municipality who can do it. So if that one person leaves, these projects may fall by the wayside. And the other thing is that you won't have this one person who's devoted to these projects in all municipalities. They're actually quite a rare species at the moment. So that's, I would say that's really.
Yeah, it's a matter of people,
Yeah.
not a matter of organization. I
Yeah.
think that's one of the problems or projects here in Spain are also facing. So it's great to hear you that it's part of a common problem also in
Yeah.
other countries, probably with more background or experience even in these kind of projects.
I mean, the one thing that I think can really help to start to solve that issue is to show other people in other municipalities around Europe doing these projects and doing them successfully. Because what I've also found is that municipalities and the people working in them, they're quite risk averse. They don't want to be seen to be backing some like completely crazy temporary use project. But then if they can see that actually those guys in Barcelona, they tried this and they did something really interesting and there were really great results for local people, that might just persuade the guys in London to also give it a go.